The moment Frances Conley felt the older woman's hand close around her wrist beneath the supper table, she knew something was wrong. Not the ordinary wrong of a stranger's bold touch, but something deeper, something that reached back through years she had buried so far down she had nearly convinced herself they did not exist. Margaret Finley's fingers were warm and dry and certain, and when she leaned close enough for her breath to brush Frances's ear, the noise of the crowded ranch house dining room seemed to fall away entirely. "Come with me," Margaret whispered. "I have been waiting for you a very long time." Frances did not move. She sat perfectly still, while the hands of every ranch hand at that table scooped beans and cornbread and sliced beef without pause, while Jacob Finley at the head of the table laughed at something his foreman Red Harper had said, while the kerosene lamps swung their amber light across every ordinary, unknowing face. She told herself she had misheard. She told herself the long days of travel and the dust still gritty in her lungs were playing tricks on her tired mind. But Margaret Finley was not a woman who misused words. Frances had known that from the first moment she had climbed down from the stage at Caldwell, Kansas 3 days ago. The woman had standing presence that made you feel examined and weighed before a single sentence was exchanged. And now she was waiting, patient and immovable, for Frances to rise from this table. The betrayal Frances felt as she set her napkin beside her plate and quietly followed the older woman down the narrow hall and into the back parlor was not directed at Margaret. It was directed at the dark past she had arrived here carrying, the secrets she had packed alongside her 2 traveling dresses and her mother's Bible. She had believed those secrets were hers alone to carry. She had believed no one in this corner of the Kansas frontier knew the name she had been born with, or the reason she had answered a stranger's advertisement in the Topeka Commonwealth in the first place. She was wrong. Margaret closed the parlor door and turned up the oil lamp on the corner table. The room smelled of dried lavender and old wood and something faintly metallic, like old coins. The older woman's face in the warm light was remarkable, all strong angles and patient intelligence, and her gray eyes moved across Frances with the careful attention of someone reading a letter they had read before. "Sit down, child," Margaret said, in a voice that was neither unkind nor particularly gentle. "What I have to say is not the kind of thing that is said well to someone who is braced to run." Frances did not sit. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. Margaret smiled the way people smile when they have been waiting a long time for a door to open. "I know exactly who you are," she said. "The question is whether you know who my son is, and whether either of you is ready for what comes next." Frances had come to the Finley Ranch on a dry Tuesday in late October of 1882 because she had nowhere else in the world to go. That was the truth she had not written in her reply to the advertisement, and it was the truth that had ridden with her across 200 miles of Kansas grassland, while she rehearsed the version of herself she intended to present. The advertisement had asked for a woman of steady character and practical ability to join the household of a working cattle ranch near the town of Caldwell, Kansas, with the possibility of marriage to the rancher, a widower of 30 years named Jacob Finley. Frances was 26. She had steady character in the way people develop it through necessity rather than nature, through years of having no one else to be steady for them. Her practical ability was real. She had kept house for her uncle in Abilene for 3 years after her parents died of fever in the winter of 1878. She had cooked for harvest crews and mended tack, and once, memorably, helped pull a calf from a heifer in the deep mud of a spring flood. These things were true, and she had written them truthfully. What she had not written was that her name had not always been Frances Conley, or that the man she was fleeing had enough money and enough patience to follow her wherever she settled, or that the only reason she had chosen the Finley advertisement over the 3 others she had answered was a detail so small and so specific that she was not certain herself whether it was divine guidance or the desperate arithmetic of a woman who had run out of options. The advertisement had mentioned, in passing, that the ranch sat 20 miles from the Chicaskia River, on land that had been homesteaded in 1872 by a man named Thomas Finley, who had come west from Ohio. Frances's mother had grown up in Ohio. Her mother's maiden name had been Margaret Ruth Hollister, and the woman who had written the advertisement in the newspaper, who had signed it on behalf of her widowed son, was named Margaret Ruth Finley. It was probably coincidence. Frances had told herself this approximately 40 times on the stage from Abilene. It was probably coincidence, and the fact that she felt a fierce and irrational pull toward that name was nothing more than grief and loneliness manufacturing false comfort. But she had come anyway. And now Margaret Finley was standing in a parlor smelling of lavender and telling her she had been waiting, and Frances's carefully constructed story was crumbling like dry clay under rain. "Sit down," Margaret said again, and this time Frances sat. The older woman lowered herself into the wingback chair across from her, arranged her skirts with the unhurried precision of someone completely at home in their own circumstances, and folded her hands in her lap. "Your mother's name was Catherine Hollister before she married Edward Conley," she said. "She was born in Morrow County, Ohio, in 1839. She had a sister named Margaret, 2 years older, who went east for schooling, and married a man named Thomas Finley in 1869, and came with him to Kansas in 1872. The silence in the room was enormous. Frances could hear the murmur of voices from the dining room, could hear the clatter of plates being stacked, could hear her own heartbeat in a way she had never been aware of it before. "You are my nephew's child," Margaret said simply. "Your mother was my sister. I lost track of her after Thomas died and Jacob was small, and I was fighting to hold this ranch together through 2 droughts and a cattle panic. I wrote to Ohio twice, and the letters came back undeliverable. I did not stop thinking about her. I never stopped." She paused, and for the first time something shifted in those precise gray eyes, something that looked very much like grief that had been carefully carried for a long time. "When I placed that advertisement 6 months ago, I described this ranch and this land the way I always had, the way my husband and I first saw it, and I described the Chicaskia River and the homestead year. I thought if Catherine was alive and reading newspapers anywhere in Kansas, she might recognize those details. I never imagined she was gone. She died in 1878, Frances said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. My father, too, typhoid." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the grief was still there, but she had set it aside with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had survived a great deal of loss. "And then you were alone." "I went to my uncle, my father's brother in Abilene." Frances hesitated because this was the part of the story where the secrets began. "I stayed 3 years and then I left." Margaret looked at her with the careful attention that Frances was beginning to understand was simply how this woman saw the world thoroughly without blinking. "You left because of Wesley Conley," she said. Frances's hands tightened in her lap. "You know about Wesley?" "I know enough," Margaret said. "He came through Caldwell 4 months ago. He was asking questions about a woman traveling alone from Abilene." She paused. "I did not know then who he was looking for, but I remembered his face. And when you stepped off that stage 3 days ago and told me your name was Frances Conley, and I looked at your eyes and saw my sister's eyes in your face, everything became very clear. The trap Frances had been running from had a name, and that name was Wesley Conley, and he was her father's brother, the uncle who had taken her in after the fever year and given her a roof, and worked her like farmhand labor, and eventually, when she had grown from a grieving girl into a young woman who drew attention, begun to look at her in a way that made her skin go cold and her sleep go thin and brittle. She had fled Abilene with $12 and a carpetbag and a ferocious determination to put enough distance between herself and that man that he could never find her. She had changed her hair and kept her name, because her name was her mother's name and her father's name, and she had refused to surrender it to her own fear. She had apparently not put enough distance. "He is looking for you," Margaret said. "He will eventually find his way here. When he does, I want you to understand something clearly." She leaned forward slightly. This is my ranch. I have run it for 10 years since Thomas died, with Jacob's help for the last 7 of those. No man comes onto this land and removes anything from it that does not wish to be removed. Do you understand me?" Frances looked at this woman, this stranger who was not a stranger, and felt something so unfamiliar she almost could not name it. It was the sensation of being protected. It was the sensation of not being alone. And underneath it, threaded through it, was the complicated awareness that she was sitting in the ranch house of the man she had come to potentially marry, and that man was this woman's son, and the entire foundation of her arrival here was far more complicated and more intimate than she had told him or anyone else. "You have not told Jacob," she said. "No," Margaret agreed. "I thought you should know first. I thought you deserved to know the truth before you decided anything." She paused. "But Frances, he needs to know eventually. He is a good man. He is not a man who responds well to hidden things." Frances stood slowly. Through the parlor wall she could hear the dining room sounds shifting, chairs scraping back, the deep rumble of Jacob Finley's voice saying something that made Red Harper laugh again. She had spent 3 days watching Jacob Finley from a careful distance, noting his methodical competence around the ranch, his even-handed treatment of the men who worked for him, his quiet attentiveness when she spoke at meals, the way he listened with his whole face instead of just waiting for her to finish. She had liked him with a wariness she could not afford to surrender to, because she had been so certain she was deceiving him. Now she understood that the deception had been mutual and far more ancient than either of them knew and far more tender. "I need to think," she said. "Of course you do," Margaret said. "Sleep on it, but do not take too long. Wesley Conley asked about you in this town, and small towns have long memories." Frances lay awake in the small room they had given her at the end of the upstairs hall, listening to the prairie wind work at the eaves of the house, listening to the immense dark silence of the open Kansas land beyond the window. The stars out here were extraordinary, dense and cold, and indifferent to every human complication. She had noticed them the first night and felt small in a way that was almost comforting, because if the universe was that large and that old, then perhaps her particular trouble was not as final as it felt. But Wesley was real and he was searching, and the safety she had thought she was running toward was still conditional, still fragile, still one accident of bad timing away from collapse. She thought about Jacob Finley. She had formed her first opinion of him before he had spoken a single word to her. He had been standing in the yard when the stage arrived, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done physical work all their adult lives, with dark hair and sun-darkened skin, and the kind of stillness about him that very confident or very private people carry. He had not come forward in a rush the way she had feared a lonely man might. He had waited while his mother greeted her, waited while the luggage was dealt with, and only then had walked over and introduced himself with a directness that was neither forward nor cold. "Jacob Finley," he had said, and shaken her hand the way a person shakes the hand of someone they intend to take seriously. "You've had a long trip. Are you hungry?" She had been extraordinarily hungry, and the directness of the question had made her laugh, a real laugh that surprised her, and something in his face had shifted at the sound of it. Some small private warmth had come into his expression and then been quietly set aside, as if he were being careful with it. She had watched him across 3 days of ranch life, and formed the opinion that Jacob Finley was a man who had been badly hurt by his wife's death 2 years ago, and who had not fully finished grieving, who had placed the advertisement not out of loneliness in any shallow sense, but out of a genuine recognition that this ranch and this life required partnership, that he could not build what he wanted to build alone. She respected that clarity. She recognized it because she had the same clarity about her own need for something real and stable, something that was not a transaction or a hiding place. But now she understood she had arrived here under a hidden truth, and that truth changed everything. She rose before dawn and dressed quietly and went downstairs and out to the yard. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of dry grass and distant cattle and the faint iron of coming weather. She walked to the fence line of the home pasture and stood there watching the darkness thin, and the stars go out one by one, and the eastern edge of the world begin its slow blush toward morning. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the hard ground, unhurried, the slight jingle of a spur rowel. Jacob Finley came to stand beside her at the fence, and for a long moment he said nothing, just looked at the same horizon she was looking at. He was wearing a canvas coat over his work clothes, and his breath made small clouds in the cold air. "You are awake early," he said finally. "I could not sleep," she said honestly. He nodded as if this were not unusual. "I come out here most mornings before the work starts," he said. "It is the quietest part of the day." Once Red Harper is awake, silence becomes a theoretical concept. She laughed again, that same surprised laugh, and he turned his head and looked at her, and this time he did not put the warmth away quite as quickly. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "I know it is a lot to adjust to, a new place and a new situation. I do not want you to feel pressured into any decision you are not certain of." Frances turned to look at him directly, which she had been somewhat careful about doing because there was an intensity in his dark eyes that she was not ready to examine too closely. "Your mother spoke with me last night," she said. Something moved in his expression. "About what?" "About the advertisement." "About why I came," she paused. "About things that were not in the advertisement." He was very still. He had the quality of great stillness she had noticed before, the kind of stillness that is not passivity but deep attention. "What did she tell you?" "That she placed the advertisement partly in hope that my mother might see it," Frances said. "That my mother was her sister." The silence stretched between them across the pale cold morning, and the long grass moved in the wind, and somewhere behind the barn a rooster announced the light with aggressive enthusiasm. "You are her niece," Jacob said slowly. "Yes." He looked back at the horizon. His jaw was tight, and she could see him processing this, reorganizing everything he understood about the last 3 days. "She did not tell me," he said. "She told me first," Frances said. "I think she thought I deserved to know before decisions were made. I think she was right." She paused. "I also need to tell you something she did not know until recently. Something that has nothing to do with family connection and everything to do with why I answered this particular advertisement so urgently." He turned back to her and waited. She told him about Wesley. She told him clearly and without embellishment, and without performing the kind of quiet suffering she had noticed some women deployed to manage male sympathy. She told him factually, the way she wished she had been told factual things when she needed to know them. She told him what her uncle had been, what he had wanted, and how she had left and where she had gone and how far she had come and what she suspected was still coming. When she finished, his face was very quiet. The careful, attending quiet she was beginning to understand was his way of being angry without being reckless about it. "He came through Caldwell," Jacob said. "Your mother told me, 4 months ago." "I remember a man asking questions in town," he said slowly. "Red mentioned it. Said some fellow from Abilene was asking about a woman traveling alone. We did not connect it to anything at the time." He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "I am glad you told me." "I almost did not," she admitted. "It would have been easier to say nothing and see how things developed. But your mother said you were not a man who responds well to hidden things." "My mother," he said, with a complicated expression that contained affection and exasperation in approximately equal measure, "is extremely frequently correct, which is one of the more challenging aspects of living with her." Frances felt the laugh rise in her chest and let it come, and this time he laughed too, briefly, and the cold morning air felt slightly warmer. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She appreciated the question enormously, the directness of it, the way it gave her the agency of it. "I want to stay," she said. "If that is still welcome, not because I have nowhere else to go, although that is true, but because I have been here 3 days and this is already the most honest I have felt in years, and I think that deserves some attention." He nodded slowly. "It is still welcome," he said. "And the other thing, your uncle, If he comes here, he will deal with me before he deals with you. That is not negotiable." The fierceness beneath the even delivery of that sentence sent something warm and startling through her. She had not been defended by anyone in 4 years. She had forgotten the weight of it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went past courtesy. They stood together watching the sun come over the edge of the world, and neither of them moved to go back inside until the rooster had been at it for a very long time, and the first of the ranch hands was visible crossing the yard toward the horses. And even then Jacob Finley moved unhurriedly, as though nothing that required his presence could begin without him. And Frances Conley watched him go and stood alone at the fence for another minute with her hands around the top rail and the sun full on her face, and for the first time in a very long time did not feel like she was running. The weeks that followed were a revelation in ordinary things. Frances had come to this land prepared to be useful, and she was. She was a capable cook and a better one than she had let on, having learned from her mother, who had learned from a grandmother who had made feeding people into something approaching an art form. The ranch house meals shifted quickly from the serviceable but uninspired cooking that had apparently been the standard before her arrival to something that made the ranch hands eat with visible gratitude, and made Red Harper, a laconic man of 40 who had been with the Finleys for 6 years, actually say grace with genuine enthusiasm before the evening meal. Margaret Finley watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has made a calculated decision and seen it prove out. She and Frances developed an understanding that was not exactly warmth yet, but was the solid precursor to it, built of shared tasks and honest exchange and the particular intimacy of two women who recognized each other's competence and did not feel threatened by it. Frances learned the ranch. She learned its rhythms and its geography, the pastures that held water after rain and the ones that went dry by August, the particular personalities of the horses and which of the ranch hands were reliable and which required supervision and in what specific ways. She learned to read the weather from the quality of light on the southwestern horizon, the way clouds built differently here than they had in Abilene, the way the wind from the south meant warmth and the wind from the northwest meant batten down and prepare. She learned Jacob. She learned that he was meticulous about the things that mattered and relaxed about the things that did not, which meant he was rarely agitated, but when he was, the cause was significant. She learned that he read when the day allowed it, keeping a small shelf of books in his office beside the tall desk where he kept the ranch accounts, and that his tastes ran to history and natural science, and occasionally, when he thought no one was watching, poetry. She discovered the poetry by accident, coming into the office one afternoon to ask about the dinner hour and finding him reading with complete absorption, and she saw the title on the spine of the slim volume before he set it on the desk with an ease that was almost but not quite casual. She did not mention it. But the next evening at supper she quoted, without attribution, 2 lines from Longfellow, and something in his expression told her he knew exactly where those lines came from, and something in her expression told him she knew he knew, and they had an entire conversation in those 2 seconds of eye contact that neither of them was quite ready to have out loud. The temperature between them was rising slowly, the way a Kansas autumn does not admit cold all at once but retreats and advances and retreats again, so that you are not certain you are in a different season until one morning you step outside and your breath is visible, and you think, yes, here it is. He found reasons to be near her. He was not obvious about it, which she respected, but she noticed. He appeared in the kitchen in the late morning when the ranch hands were out on the land and Margaret was in the garden, and he did not have a particular reason to be there, but he stayed and talked while she worked, and their conversations ranged from the practical to the personal in a way that felt entirely natural and left her thoughtful for hours afterward. He told her about his wife, Sarah, on an afternoon in early November when they were mending the fence along the eastern pasture together, Frances holding the wire while he worked the staples. He spoke about her with a directness that had grief in it, but not the raw, open grief of a wound still fresh. It was the contained, careful grief of someone who had worked hard to honor their loss without being devoured by it. She did not love this land, he said. Not the way I do. She tried, and she never complained, and I will always honor her for that. But she was a city woman from Lawrence, and she found the isolation hard. I found it hard that she found it hard, and we were both too stubborn to say so clearly enough. He straightened and looked across the wide open pasture. When she died, part of what I grieved was the conversation we had not had, the honest one. Frances thought about all the conversations she herself had not had in the years of her life, all the things held back for self-protection that had accumulated into a kind of loneliness she had carried so long she had stopped noticing its weight. I think that is one of the cruelest aspects of loss, she said. It makes permanent all the things that were not finished. He looked at her with that complete attention she had come to depend on without intending to. Yes, he said. That exactly. They finished the fence in a warm silence that said more than most conversations manage. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. Frances was in the side yard hanging washing when she heard the horse come through the gate, and she looked up and felt the cold rush of recognition that she had been half preparing for and half refusing to prepare for ever since Margaret's warning. Wesley Conley rode into the Finley ranch yard on a brown horse that needed feeding, wearing a dusty black coat and a wide hat, and the particular expression of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has finally found it. He was 44 years old, lean and weathered, with her father's jaw and none of her father's decency. He scanned the yard and found her immediately, and when he smiled, the smile did not reach his eyes by a long margin. "Frances," he said, stepping down from the horse with the ease of a practiced horseman, "I have been looking all over this territory for you." "I am aware," she said. She did not back up. She had promised herself that if this moment came, she would not back up. "You should not have bothered." "I am your family," he said, and the word family in his mouth was a trap with good upholstery, comfortable looking and hollow. "Your father would have wanted me to see you settled safely." "My father," Frances said, "knew nothing about the man you became. He died before you showed him." Wesley's expression hardened at the edges. "That is not a way to speak to family." "I will speak to you however I choose," she said. "And I will tell you plainly that this is not your land and I am not your obligation, and you should get back on that horse." He looked around the yard with the calculating attention of a man taking inventory. He looked at the house, the barn, the corrals, the width of the operation, and Frances saw him do the arithmetic, saw him conclude that this was a prosperous ranch and she was living in the house of a prosperous man, and the calculation in his eyes shifted from simple possessiveness to something more complicated and more dangerous. "Whose place is this?" he asked. "Mine." Jacob Finley came around the corner of the barn with a fence post over one shoulder and Red Harper 2 steps behind him, and the scene rearranged itself in a way that was not exactly threatening, but left no ambiguity about the geometry of it. Jacob set the fence post against the barn wall without hurry. He looked at Wesley with the quiet, absolutely composed attention he brought to everything that mattered, and Wesley looked back at him, and the two men took each other's measure in the 5 seconds of silence before Jacob spoke. "You are on private land," Jacob said. "Can I help you with something?" "I am looking for my niece," Wesley said. He nodded toward Frances. "There she is." "Miss Conley is a member of this household," Jacob said. "If she wished to be found by you, you would have heard from her directly." He paused. "She does not appear to have written." Wesley's jaw worked. "I have every right to see to her welfare." "She is seeing to it herself," Jacob said, "quite effectively." Red Harper, who had said nothing, was standing in the specific posture of a man who has been in enough difficult situations to know what posture is useful for them. Wesley looked between Jacob and Frances and then back at Jacob, and he was smart enough. Frances had always known he was smart. He was smart enough to read what was in front of him. He was smart enough to know that the man watching him with those quiet, absolutely certain dark eyes was not going to be moved by social pressure or family argument or anything short of a legal document. And Wesley did not have a legal document because there was nothing legally binding him to Frances, and he knew it. "This is not finished," he said to Frances. "Yes, it is," she said. He looked at Jacob once more, a look that had both calculation and the beginning of a retreat in it. And then he remounted his horse and rode back through the gate and out onto the road going north, and did not look back. Frances stood in the yard until the sound of the hoofbeats faded, and then she let out a breath that seemed to contain approximately a year's worth of compressed anxiety. Her hands were steady. She was glad of that. Jacob came to stand beside her. He did not ask if she was all right, which was the right instinct, because she was visibly all right, and the question would have made her feel fragile rather than capable. "Do you think he will come back?" he asked instead. "I do not know," she said honestly. "He will if he thinks there is something to gain. If he concludes there is not, he will find some other way to occupy himself." She paused. "He is not a courageous man. He is an opportunistic one. They tend to move on when the opportunity closes." Jacob nodded. "Red will sleep in the bunkhouse nearest the road for a while," he said, "just as a precaution." "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said. "I want to." She looked at him then fully, the way she had been allowing herself to look at him more and more as the weeks had passed, and he was looking back at her in the way that had started to happen recently, where the careful restraint was still there, but the warmth behind it was no longer even slightly hidden. "Thank you," she said, for the second time, in the same way she had meant it the first time. He nodded once, and then Red Harper said something dry and practical about the fence post, and Jacob picked it back up and went back to work, and Frances went back to the washing, and neither of them could have said precisely what had shifted in that brief exchange, but both of them knew that something had. Margaret Finley watched this development from the kitchen window and said nothing to either of them, which was the most eloquent form of approval available to her. November deepened and the temperature dropped, and the routine of the ranch shifted into its winter preparations. Cattle were moved to the south pastures closer to the river, where the cottonwoods provided some shelter. Hay was stacked and inventoried. The bunkhouse chimney was repaired. Frances learned to make the thick dried bean soup that the ranch hands wanted through the cold months, learned the particular way the Finley stove performed in cold weather, learned where the drafts came in the house and stuffed them with rags. She and Jacob read in the evenings, sometimes separately and sometimes in the same room, and the presence of another person reading was its own quiet conversation, and occasionally one of them would look up from their book and find the other already looking, and the moment would hold for one beat longer than accidental before they both looked back down. He kissed her for the first time on a late November afternoon when a sudden cold front blew in from the northwest and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in 2 hours and brought a thin, hard sleet that rattled against the windows like gravel. Frances had been bringing eggs in from the henhouse when the front arrived, and had come in through the back door red-faced and shivering and laughing at the suddenness of it. And Jacob had been standing at the kitchen table looking at a map of the south pastures, and he had looked up at her laughing there in the doorway with sleet in her hair and an apron full of eggs, and something in his expression had simply given way. He crossed the kitchen in about 2 steps and kissed her in a way that was both completely decisive and completely gentle, one hand against the side of her face, and Frances stood absolutely still for 1/2 second of pure surprise, and then kissed him back with a directness that matched his own. They broke apart and looked at each other, and there was a moment that could have gone either way, could have been awkward and careful and retreated from, and it did not go that way. "I have wanted to do that since approximately the second morning you were here," he said, and the honesty of it, the clean, plain honesty of a man who had promised himself to not leave important conversations unfinished, undid her completely. "I know," she said. "I have been aware." "And?" he asked. "And I have been trying very hard to be sensible about it," she said, "because of everything complicated, because of what I was not telling you." because I did not want to confuse gratitude with something else. Is it something else? He asked. She set the eggs down on the table with great care and looked at him with the directness that had become her own natural register. Yes, she said. It is something entirely else. He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile completely, without the careful management of it, and it was extraordinary. Margaret came into the kitchen 40 seconds later with an absolutely unsurprised expression, and said she supposed supper would not cook itself, and both Jacob and Frances found reasons to be very busy with different things while she pretended not to be quietly delighted. December came, and with it the particular beautiful harshness of a Kansas winter, days so clear and cold that the world looked like glass, nights when the stars were brilliant white fire overhead, and the coyotes talked to each other across the frozen prairie. Frances had always found winters difficult, the compressed darkness of them, the way they invited the kinds of thoughts she had spent years training herself not to have. But this winter was different. This winter she was not alone. She and Jacob walked in the evenings after supper when the weather allowed, along the fence line of the home pasture where the cottonwood trees stood bare and silver against the fading sky, and they talked with the unguarded ease of people who have decided to trust each other. They talked about their childhoods and their losses and their ambitions and their fears, not in the confessional way of people unburdening themselves, but in the natural way of people genuinely interested in who the other person is, and how they arrived at being that person. He told her about watching his father build this ranch from a single section of homestead land, about the droughts and the grasshopper plague of 1874 that had stripped the pastures to bare dirt, about the cattle drive losses of the bad years, and the way his father had responded to each disaster with a methodical patience that Jacob had absorbed through simple proximity. He told her about his own particular relationship with this land, the way he felt connected to it in a way he had always found difficult to articulate because it sounded excessive. "It is not just property," he said, on one of those cold evenings, standing with her at the fence line where the first light of stars was coming into the darkening sky. "I know how that sounds, but it feels like a responsibility. Like this specific piece of ground was given to us in trust, and we have to leave it better than we found it." "That does not sound excessive," Frances said. "That sounds like the only sensible way to think about it." He looked at her. "My wife thought it was romantic nonsense," he said. "She was not entirely wrong." "She was entirely wrong," Frances said with a conviction that surprised her. "Caring about something beyond yourself is not nonsense. It is the whole point." He was quiet for a long moment. "Will you stay?" he asked. And the question was not about the winter or the season but about something much larger, and they both knew it. Frances had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully, in the way she thought about everything she could not afford to get wrong. She had thought about the complicated fact that she had come here in flight and not in freedom, and whether a decision made from necessity could be trusted as a decision made from genuine choice. She had thought about the way she felt in this house, with these people on this land. She had thought about Margaret's gray eyes and Jacob's careful honesty, and the way the dawn looked from the home pasture fence. "Yes," she said. "I want to stay." He reached across the fence rail and took her hand, and they stood like that while the stars multiplied overhead and the land around them went quiet with cold, and the lights of the house were warm amber squares in the darkness behind them. They were married in January of 1883 in the small Presbyterian church in Caldwell, a ceremony that was attended by Margaret Finley and Red Harper, and 5 of the other ranch hands, and the minister's wife, and a handful of townspeople who had strong opinions about community events. The minister, a serious young man named Reverend Aldrich, who had been in Caldwell for 2 years, and was still occasionally startled by the directness of frontier people, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and considerable relief that no one cried until they were already outside. Frances cried a little. She was not a person who cried easily or often, But standing beside Jacob Finley in the cold January light with Margaret's hand briefly on her arm and her mother's Bible carried, because she had carried it everywhere since Abilene, she felt the weight of everything she had come through and everything she had arrived at, and tears were the appropriate response. Jacob saw her eyes bright and did not make a fuss about it. He simply put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm and held it there, which was exactly right. The wedding supper was at the ranch, a table full of food that Frances and Margaret had spent 2 days preparing, and Red Harper gave a toast that was brief and gruff and unexpectedly touching, saying that Jacob was a better man than most, and that Miss Conley, which he corrected himself to say Mrs. Finley, was the first person since Thomas Finley died who had made the ranch feel like the kind of place that would still be standing in 100 years. Margaret stood up after Red sat down and said nothing for a moment, looking at her son, and the woman beside him with the particular expression of someone who has survived enough to know what survival is worth. And then she said only that she had waited a long time for this table to be this full, and that she was grateful. Frances looked at her and understood exactly what she meant. The winter passed and spring came to the Kansas prairie with its tremendous, overwhelming abundance after the cold, the grass greening almost violently in April, the Chicaskia running high and fast, the cottonwoods leafing out in a pale spring green that looked almost luminous. Frances had heard people describe the prairie in the spring as though it were merely flat and uninteresting, and she supposed to people who had grown up in forest country it might seem thin, but she had come to love the openness of it with a ferocity that surprised her. The sky here was a different thing than sky elsewhere. It was a participant rather than a backdrop, and she had developed the habit of watching it the way Jacob watched it, with the attention of someone for whom it was both beautiful and operational. She learned cattle work, not the hard riding work of the drives, which was men's work by the convention of the time, but the management and the medicine and the record-keeping and the judgment calls that determined which animals were worth keeping for breeding stock and which should be sold. Jacob taught her because she asked to be taught, and he saw no logical reason to refuse, and she turned out to have good instinct for it, the kind of instinct that comes from paying attention rather than from years of experience, though the years would come. Red Harper watched her learn with the careful approval of a man whose professional standards were high, and whose personal ones were higher. He did not tell her she was doing well for a woman. He told her she was doing well, and the omission of the qualification was its own form of respect. The baby was born in December of 1883, a boy they named Thomas Edward Finley, Thomas for Jacob's father and Edward for Frances's, and his arrival rearranged the entire house in the way that babies do, imperious in their smallness, demanding in their innocence, turning the competent adults around them into people who sat watching a sleeping face for extraordinary lengths of time. Jacob held his son with the particular stunned tenderness of a man confronting something larger than he had prepared for, and Frances watched him in those first days and thought that this was the fullest version of him she had seen yet, this man holding a small sleeping child with his whole heart visible. Margaret was transformed. She had been a woman of great competence and great self-containment, and Thomas Edward arrived and dissolved the containment entirely. She sat with the baby at every opportunity and talked to him in a low voice about things Frances could not always hear, and when Frances asked once what she was telling him, Margaret said she was telling him about his grandmother Catherine, who had been the funniest person Margaret had ever known, and who would have loved this child extravagantly. Frances had to leave the room for a minute after that. The spring of 1884 brought a new worry with the new grass. There had been rumors all winter of range disputes to the west, of large cattle operations pushing onto land that smaller ranchers held by homestead claim, but not always by the stronger force of money and connection. The period was dangerous for people who had built carefully and honestly, because the men with capital and lawyers were aggressive in their acquisition, and not always particular about the legal foundations of it. One of those men was a cattle baron named Carver Holt, who had built a substantial operation 60 miles west, and whose habits of expansion had already absorbed 3 smaller ranches in the past 2 years, 2 of them voluntarily, and one in a way that was technically legal and practically coercive. Jacob had a section of land along the Chicaskia that Holt wanted for water access. Holt sent a man to make an offer in April, and Jacob declined the offer with complete courtesy and absolute finality, and the man went back and reported, and Holt sent a more substantial offer in May, and Jacob declined that one too. In June, 2 of the Finley boundary fences were cut. Jacob rode the perimeter with Red and 2 of the hands, and they repaired the cuts and reinforced the post anchors, and Jacob's expression throughout this process was the careful quiet that Frances had learned to read as his version of deep anger held under control. That evening, Frances sat across from him in the office while he wrote a letter to the county sheriff documenting the fence cuts, and she watched him write with the precise, deliberate care of a man constructing a record, and she said, "What does Holt actually want?" "The river frontage," Jacob said, 200 acres of it. It would give him water rights for another 10,000 head and cut our access to the main channel. And if he cannot buy it, Jacob looked up from the letter. "He will keep trying other methods," he said, "and we will keep dealing with each method as it comes." "That is very calm," she said. "I am not calm," he said. "I am strategic." Frances studied her husband's face and saw beneath the strategy the genuine fury of a man whose land, which was his family's land, which was his children's land, was being tested by someone who had decided that having more money was the same as having more right. "What do we have legally?" she asked. "Clean title," he said. "Homestead patent from 1872. The river frontage deed is solid. Holt knows it, which is why he is cutting fences instead of filing claims." He paused. "He is trying to make us frustrated enough to sell. It is a patience game." "Then we will be more patient," Frances said. Jacob looked at her with the warm directness she had come to live inside like a climate. "Yes," he said. "We will." They dealt with Holt the way Jacob had described, which was methodically. Every fence cut was documented and reported. Every suspicious incident around the perimeter was recorded. Frances kept the records, organized and detailed, because she had the systematic mind for it, and because records were the proof of good faith, and she understood what proof of good faith was worth. In August, Holt sent another man, not a negotiator this time but a lawyer. A man named Forsyth from Wichita with a briefcase and a narrow face, and the particular confidence of someone who has won most arguments on technical grounds. Forsyth sat in the Finley parlor and explained in considerable detail why it would be in the Finley family's long-term interest to reconsider Holt's offer. Frances served coffee and sat in the corner and said nothing while Jacob listened to the lawyer with complete patience, and then said that he understood the argument and did not find it persuasive, that the Finley ranch was not for sale and not for partial sale, and he wished Mr. Forsyth a comfortable journey back to Wichita. After Forsyth left, Frances said, "He mentioned a water rights challenge. Can Holt actually file one?" "Not successfully," Jacob said, "but he can file one expensively. He knows a legal fight costs money regardless of outcome." "Then we need our own lawyer," Frances said. Jacob hesitated, because the cost of a lawyer in Wichita was not a trivial thing for a ranch operating on honest margins. Frances watched him calculate and then said, "I have some money. Not much, but some. My mother left it with her sister in Ohio, and I never collected it because I did not want Wesley to know where I was or where the money was. I wrote to Ohio in February." "It is in a bank in Caldwell." Jacob looked at her. "That is your money," he said. "We are married," she said. "This is our ranch. Thomas Edwards' pastures are on the other side of that fence line." The argument was not long. Jacob retained a lawyer from Wichita named Abernathy, who reviewed the Finley title and water rights and declared them unassailable. And this information was communicated to Forsyth in terms that were professionally cordial and legally conclusive. and Holt made one more approach the following spring, a reasonable offer that Jacob declined with the same courtesy as the others. And after that Holt found other territory to the north, and the fence cuts stopped, and the Chicaskia ran along the Finley land the same as it always had. Margaret Finley had turned 62 in the spring of 1885, and she had begun to slow in the particular way that strong people slow, which is that they simply do not pretend otherwise. They acknowledge the change and adapt without complaint, but also without the performance of wellness they do not feel. She gave up the heavier garden work and passed it to Frances, who expanded the kitchen garden considerably and added a second vegetable plot along the south side of the house that Margaret had suggested but never gotten to. She spent more time in the parlor with her books and with Thomas Edward, who at 18 months was mobile and vocal, and entirely convinced that Margaret existed primarily for his entertainment. One evening in September of 1885, Frances sat beside Margaret in the parlor while Jacob did accounts in the office and Thomas Edward slept upstairs, and Margaret said without preamble, "I am glad I wrote that advertisement." "So am I," Frances said. "I was not sure what I was hoping for," Margaret said. "I thought perhaps Jacob needed someone, and I thought perhaps someone out there was Catherine's daughter, grown and alone and needed a home." She paused. "I did not expect the same person to answer both requirements." Frances looked at her aunt, which was still, nearly 3 years on, a thought that carried a complicated tenderness. "Did you know?" she asked. "When you saw me at the stage, did you know then?" "Your eyes," Margaret said. "The exact color of your mother's. I knew before you told me your name." "Why did you wait until supper?" "Because I wanted to watch you for a few hours first," Margaret said, with the absolute honesty that ran in this family like a shared bloodline. "To see if you were someone my son could love. The family connection mattered, but it was not sufficient by itself." "And what did you conclude?" Frances asked. Margaret smiled, the full warm smile that was rarer than her usual expression and entirely worth waiting for. "I concluded," she said, "that you were exactly what this house had been missing for a very long time." Frances reached over and took her aunt's hand, and they sat like that while the lamp burned low and the prairie darkness settled over the land outside. The second child was born in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Catherine Margaret, and she arrived in the world with the particular assertive energy of someone who had been planning for this appearance for some time. Margaret held her namesake for the first time with tears running freely down her face, and made no effort whatsoever to stop them, and Frances thought this was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Jacob looked at his daughter and then at his wife and said, "She has your mother's eyes," which was both accurate and exactly the right thing to say, and Frances loved him for it in a way that went beyond the word love's ordinary capacity. The spring and summer of 1886 were good years. The cattle market was strong, the Chicaskia ran full, the south pastures greened early and held through July without too much burning. Red Harper, who had been at the Finley ranch since before Thomas Finley died, proposed marriage to a widow from Caldwell named Edna Pierce, who ran a small dry goods operation and had 3 children of her own and was, by all available evidence, extremely good for Red's persistent tendency toward unnecessary stoicism. The wedding was at the ranch, a cheerful late June afternoon affair with borrowed tables set out in the yard, and Margaret Finley's cornbread and Frances Conley Finley's roasted beef, and enough pie to occasion serious comment from all parties. Frances stood in the yard in the warm evening watching her neighbors and her husband's hands and her aunt and her 2 small children navigate the festivity, and she felt the particular happiness that is not the explosive happiness of moments but the deep-settled happiness of a life that has become exactly what it ought to be. Jacob came to stand beside her, as he had on that first October morning at the fence line, and handed her a glass of lemonade. "Red looks terrified," he said. "Red looks," Frances said, considering, "like a man who has wanted something for a long time and cannot quite believe he has it." Jacob looked at her. "I know the feeling," he said. She leaned against him, which was a thing she had come to do without thinking, the way you come to depend on the presence of something that has been reliably there long enough to feel like structure rather than gift, though it was both. "Do you remember that first morning?" she asked. "At the fence?" "I remember being very cold," he said, "and very interested in not being obvious about how interested I was in the woman standing beside me." She laughed. "You were not particularly successful." "I was somewhat successful," he said, with dignity. "It took until November. It took until your mother locked us in proximity long enough for nature to do the obvious work," she said. He laughed, a full, unmanaged laugh, the kind that he saved for genuine amusement, and she felt it against her shoulder. "She will be pleased you think so." Margaret was, at that moment, sitting in a chair near the house with Catherine on her lap and Thomas Edward standing beside her with both hands on her knee, telling her something of considerable importance that involved a great deal of pointing at the barn. She looked up and caught Frances watching her and smiled with a completeness that said everything worth saying. In the fall of 1887, Wesley Conley died in Abilene. Frances learned of it through a letter from the county clerk there, who had been charged with notifying her as Edward Conley's daughter. Wesley had died of pneumonia, alone, in a rented room, which was a fact that Frances sat with for several days with complicated feelings that she eventually described to Jacob as the grief for a man who had been given every opportunity to be decent and had consistently chosen otherwise. "He was the last person who knew your parents," Jacob said. "Yes," she said. "That is the part that is actually sad." He held her that evening for a long time without trying to fix anything or say the right thing, just being the solid, present, honest man he was, and Frances thought about how long she had carried the fear of Wesley without anyone to carry it beside her, and how different the weight of difficult things was when you were not carrying them alone. The ranch grew through the late 1880s, not dramatically but steadily, with the kind of growth that comes from good judgment compounded year over year. Jacob added pasture by purchase to the south, a clean transaction with a retired homesteader moving to Caldwell for his health. The cattle operation expanded from a cow-calf program into a more sophisticated stocker operation that took advantage of the Kansas City market's growing appetite. Frances took on more of the business management, the accounts and the contracts and the correspondence with buyers, which suited her organized mind and her complete unsentimental clarity about numbers. Red Harper proved to be a genuinely excellent foreman now that he had Edna's company in the evenings, and something to come home to besides the bunkhouse, and his particular combination of practical experience and unshowy reliability became more valuable as the operation grew. Thomas Edward grew into a sturdy, curious 6-year-old who followed his father everywhere with the dedicated attention of a small apprentice, and Catherine Margaret grew into a spirited, decisive child who had her great-grandmother's organizational instincts and her great-aunt Margaret's particular way of looking at you directly when she wanted to know something. Margaret Finley's health declined gradually through 1888, in the quiet, steady way that has no drama but accumulates to something large. She was never bedridden, never entirely unable to manage herself, but she became smaller in the way of the elderly, more contained within the house, and then within a smaller portion of the house, and her afternoon chair in the parlor became her particular kingdom, where she received Thomas Edward and Catherine, and their endless reports of the day's events with the thoroughness of a monarch staying current on foreign affairs. She told Frances, on an afternoon in October of 1888, that she wanted to tell her something while she was entirely clear-headed and wanted to be sure it was said. Frances sat beside her and waited. "I did not know what I was doing when I placed that advertisement," Margaret said. "I thought I was helping Jacob find a practical solution to a practical problem. I thought maybe I was reaching back toward my sister across 20 years of silence." She paused. "I did not know I was setting in motion the best thing I had done since I convinced Thomas Finley to come west with me in 1872. She looked at Frances with the clear gray eyes that had looked at her across a parlor table on her first night here, those same eyes that had seen her mother in her face. "I am grateful for you," she said. "Not for what you have done for this family, though you have done everything for this family. I am grateful for who you are." Frances held her aunt's hand and could not speak for a moment. When she could, she said, "You saved my life. You wrote an advertisement for a different reason entirely, and it found me precisely when I had nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose. I owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," Margaret said. "Everything you have here you built. I just opened the door." Margaret Finley died on a bright cold morning in November of 1888, in her own room, in her own bed, with Jacob sitting beside her and Frances in the chair near the window, and the sound of Thomas Edward and Catherine playing in the yard below drifting up through the glass. She died with the particular peacefulness of a woman who had done everything she had set out to do and had no unfinished conversations. They buried her on the ranch, at the foot of the cottonwood grove near the Chicaskia, beside Thomas Finley, and the simple headstone said Margaret Ruth Finley, beloved, and the dates, and Frances added below the dates in her own careful lettering the words she opened the door. The grief of that winter was real and deep, and Jacob moved through it with the careful steadiness of a man who had learned, from his mother's own example, that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be made room for. Frances stayed close to him in the way he had stayed close to her when Wesley died, not fixing but being present, and they grew through the grief the way marriages grow through all the large things, by moving through them together instead of around them separately. Spring came again, as it always did out here with its overwhelming, insistent beauty, and Thomas Edward was 7 and could ride alone on a gentle horse across the home pasture, and pointed out to his father with serious authority a weakness in the barn south wall that Jacob acknowledged and repaired, and said nothing about the fact that the boy was correct. Catherine was 4 and had strong opinions about the color of ribbons and the right way to arrange things on tables, and the specific injustice of not being allowed to go where her brother went, which was most places. On a May evening in 1889, Frances and Jacob sat on the porch of the ranch house in the warm dusk, listening to the frogs starting up along the Chicaskia and the distant complaint of a meadowlark, and Jacob reached over and took her hand the way he had at the fence line in their first November, and she laced her fingers through his the way she had every time since. "I have been thinking," he said, "about adding onto the house." "Have you?" she said. "The children will need more space as they get older, and there is room on the east side to extend the parlor and add 2 rooms above." He paused. "And possibly we will need more room anyway." She turned her head and looked at him in the fading light. "Possibly," she said, and her voice had a quality in it that made him look back at her very carefully. "Frances," he said. "Probably," she corrected herself, and the smile she was attempting to contain came through entirely. He pulled her closer with a quiet, complete joy that had nothing held back in it, and they sat together in the warm May evening, while the prairie settled into its enormous, indifferent, beautiful darkness around them, and the lights of their house were warm behind them, and their children were asleep upstairs, and the land they were responsible for ran out in every direction under the stars. And everything they had built from fear and flight, and an advertisement in a newspaper, and a woman's patient waiting was exactly what it had become, exactly what it was, and it was more than enough. Thomas Edward Finley, who would grow up to be a rancher like his father and his grandfather before him, would one day show his own children the headstone at the Cottonwood Grove and read them the inscription, and they would ask him what it meant, who had opened the door, and he would tell them about a woman named Margaret who had written a letter to a newspaper because she was looking for her lost family, and the niece who had come 200 miles through fear to find it, and the son who had been waiting at the fence line for something he could not name yet, and how all 3 of them had found each other in a Kansas autumn and built something that lasted. That was in the future. Tonight there was only the porch and the dusk and the frogs and the warm hand of the man beside her, and the deep certain knowledge that she was home. Frances Conley Finley had come to this land with nothing but a carpetbag and a dark past, and her mother's Bible and $12, and the desperate hope that somewhere on the Kansas prairie there was a door open for her. She had found a man who kissed her in a kitchen during a sleet storm and listened to her with his whole face, and rode out to meet a threat without drama and read poetry when he thought no one was watching. She had found an aunt she had never known she had, who had looked at her face and seen her mother's eyes and opened every door she had. She had found land that demanded everything and gave everything back. The advertisement in the Topeka Commonwealth had asked for a woman of steady character and practical ability. Frances had come with those things because necessity had built them in her. She had arrived with much more and much less than anyone had expected, and the ranch had met her exactly as she was, and the man had met her exactly as she was, and the fierce, particular, earned happiness of her life was the result. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought in the settling May darkness with Jacob's hand warm in hers and the stars coming out one by one overhead. It was everything she had been running toward without knowing it, and she had arrived, and she was staying, and the door that had been opened for her was now the door of her own home, and she would never again have cause to run.